On the vast, untamed American frontier, where silence often stretched for miles, the very act of speaking was a potent force. For Abraham Lincoln, born into this sparse world, words were not just tools for communication, they were intellectual, anchors, moral compasses, and ultimately, the very engines of change. This is the origin story of his unique mastery over language, a skill forged not in classrooms, but in the crucible of necessity, observation, and an insatiable yearning for clarity. His early life in the log cabins of Indiana and Illinois offered no formal tutors, no extensive libraries. Books were rare, cherished commodities, and literacy itself was a hard-won triumph. Yet it was this scarcity that transformed every available text into a profound study, compelling young Lincoln to dissect each sentence, internalize every rhythm, and understand the profound weight of each word. The King James Bible became his foundational text, its majestic prose and moral narrative seeping into his young mind, teaching him the power of vivid imagery, compelling parables, and the solemn cadence of truth. He didn't just read it. He absorbed its very architecture of language, the way it could elevate common events into epic struggles, and how its clear, direct voice resonated with enduring human experience. This wasn't merely religious instruction. It was his primer in persuasive rhetoric. Beyond the divine, the practical world provided its own stern lessons in linguistic precision. Working as a surveyor, Lincoln discovered the unforgiving nature of exact definitions. Every boundary line, every measurement, every legal description required absolute clarity. Ambiguity could lead to disputes, errors, or even violence. This disciplined him to value conciseness, to select the precise word that left no room for misinterpretation. He learned that the power of language wasn't in grandiloquence, but in accuracy. A lesson profoundly different from the flowery oratory, common in his era. This seemingly mundane task was, in fact, a crucial early training ground for his later ability to cut through noise and deliver undeniable truths. The raw, vibrant social landscape of the frontier offered another, equally vital classroom: the art of storytelling and debate. In general stores, around campfires, and at local debating societies, words were currency, entertainment, and a means of establishing one's place. Lincoln, with his gangly frame and disarming wit, quickly became a master of the anecdote. He wasn't just telling jokes. He was studying human nature, observing reactions, learning how to build suspense, how to land a punchline, and critically, how to make a point resonate through relatable narrative. He understood that a well-placed story could disarm an opponent, clarify a complex issue, or provide a moment of shared humanity in a tense discussion. His early forays into formal debate, particularly in New Salem, were pivotal. Here, he honed his ability to construct arguments, to anticipate counterpoints, and to think on his feet. The directness of frontier audiences meant immediate feedback. He learned that bombast often failed, but clear, logical reasoning, presented with a touch of humor and an undeniable honesty, usually prevailed. He wasn't afraid to stumble. Each misstep was a lesson in refining his delivery, his tone, and his choice of words. He was developing a style that would later distinguish him, one grounded in reason, illuminated by anecdote, and delivered with a folksy charm that belied its underlying steel. Consider one of his early, often overlooked public addresses from 1832, a modest declaration for a seat in the Illinois legislature. Even then, amidst the awkward phrasing of a novice politician, glimpses of his future power emerged. He wrote, "I have no ambition so great as that of being truly esteemed of my fellow men, by rendering myself worthy of their esteem." Simple, direct, and inherently human. It was a humble statement, devoid of grand promises, yet it showcased his innate understanding that connection, not just persuasion, was built on sincerity and a shared sense of humanity. He wasn't trying to impress with intellectual prowess. He was simply being authentically himself, laying bare his motivations. This brings us to a profound insight into Lincoln's communicative genius. His upbringing in scarcity was not a limitation. but a hidden advantage. Unlike many of his formally educated peers who often relied on flowery, classical rhetoric designed to impress rather than connect, Lincoln was forced to develop a language that was precise, accessible, and deeply rooted in the common experience. He didn't learn to mimic, he learned to clarify. He didn't learn to pontificate, he learned to articulate. This forced simplicity instilled in him a profound appreciation for directness, for stripping away the unnecessary, and for finding the exact phrase that could illuminate a complex idea for anyone, regardless of their background. His words weren't intellectual exercises. They were bridges built from shared understanding. This deliberate cultivation of clarity continued as he moved into the legal profession in Springfield. The courtroom became his ultimate laboratory for logical persuasion. Law demanded meticulous attention to detail, the ability to dissect arguments, and the precise application of language to specific facts. He pored over legal texts, mastering the art of building an ironclad case not through emotional appeals, but through irrefutable logic and compelling evidence. One particularly illustrative example is his defense in the Almanac trial of 1858, where he defended Duff Armstrong against a murder charge. The prosecution's star witness claimed he saw Armstrong commit the crime in the moonlight. Lincoln, without bombast, produced an almanac to show that on the night in question, the moon was barely a sliver, and had set long before the alleged time of the murder. His words, backed by undeniable fact, cut through the fabricated testimony like a razor. It wasn't about clever wordplay. It was about exposing the truth with irrefutable evidence, presented with absolute clarity. This case wasn't just a legal victory. It was a masterclass in using facts, logic, and precise presentation to dismantle falsehoods and reveal reality. The simple almanac and Lincoln's pointed questions spoke louder than any grand speech. He learned to simplify complex legal principles into terms that a jury of farmers could grasp instantly. He would often begin his arguments with a disarming, folksy tone, telling a brief, seemingly unrelated story to establish rapport, only to then pivot to the core of his legal argument with devastating precision. He mastered the Socratic method, guiding witnesses and juries toward the truth through a series of carefully crafted questions. His cross-examinations were legendary not for their aggression, but for their relentless pursuit of clarity, chipping away at deception until the truth stood undeniable. This journey, from the scarcity of books to the precision of surveying, from the raw authenticity of frontier storytelling to the rigorous logic of the courtroom, forged a unique communicative style. Lincoln understood that words, when chosen with care, stripped of pretense, and delivered with an unwavering belief in their truth, possessed an almost mystical power. He wasn't just speaking, he was building understanding, dismantling prejudice, and planting seeds of unity, a foundational skill that would prove indispensable on the grandest stage of American history. The quiet boy who yearned for books had become the man who would reshape a nation with the sheer, undeniable force of his words. Having honed his linguistic tools in the quiet crucible of the frontier and the rigorous logic of the courtroom, Abraham Lincoln now stepped onto a far grander, far more volatile stage, the national political arena. This was a realm where words were not merely means of communication, but weapons, shields, and the very currency of power. And as the issue of slavery tore at the fabric of the nation, Lincoln's unique mastery of language would prove to be his most formidable asset in a desperate fight for the Union's soul. The mid-19th century American political landscape was a roaring torrent of passionate speeches, scathing editorials, and heated debates. It was an era defined by oratorical prowess, where a politician's standing was often measured by his ability to sway crowds and dismantle opponents with words. Lincoln, initially a relatively obscure Illinois lawyer, possessed no inherent advantages of wealth or aristocratic lineage. His path to prominence would be paved, almost entirely, by the sheer force and strategic brilliance of his communication. His early political speeches, while sometimes long-winded by modern standards, bore the hallmarks of his frontier training. He wasn't one for bombastic pronouncements or flowery abstract theories. Instead, he employed a directness, a logical progression, and a folksy charm that resonated deeply with common citizens. He understood that true persuasion didn't come from intellectual intimidation, but from making complex ideas accessible, relatable, and morally resonant. He knew how to frame an argument not just as a political position, but as a fundamental question of right and wrong. A prime example of this emerging power was his speech on the Kansas-Nebraska Act in Peoria, Illinois in 1854. This act, which allowed settlers in new territories to decide on the legality of slavery, popular sovereignty, ignited a firestorm. While many politicians offered convoluted legalistic arguments, Lincoln stripped the issue bare. He didn't just debate the policy, he attacked the moral principle underlying it. He declared, "If the Negro is a man, why then my ancient faith teaches me that all men are created equal, and that there can be no moral right in connection with one man's making a slave of another." Simple, yet devastatingly effective. He used a universal truth, a foundational American ideal, to expose the hypocrisy of the act. He was teaching his audience not just what to think, but how to think about the moral implications of slavery, drawing on shared values. But it was in the legendary Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858 that Lincoln's linguistic genius truly soared and was displayed for a national audience. 7 face-to-face confrontations across Illinois, attracting thousands, were not just political rallies. They were an intellectual, gladiatorial arena. His opponent, Stephen A. Douglas, the Little Giant, was a renowned orator, a master of popular sovereignty, and the incumbent senator. Douglas commanded respect and possessed a powerful, authoritative voice. Lincoln, by contrast, often began his addresses slowly, almost awkwardly, his high-pitched voice a stark contrast to Douglas's booming baritone. Yet it was precisely in this contrast that Lincoln's unique power emerged. Lincoln refused to be drawn into trivialities or ad hominem attacks. He remained relentlessly focused on the core moral and constitutional issues of slavery. He recognized that Douglas's concept of popular sovereignty, while seemingly democratic, was inherently flawed because it treated slavery as a matter of local preference rather than a fundamental human rights violation. He understood that by allowing individual territories to choose slavery, it chipped away at the national commitment to freedom. His strategy was brilliant in its simplicity and profound in its execution. Instead of overwhelming the audience with complex legal arguments, he used Socratic questioning to expose the inconsistencies in Douglas's position. He would pose seemingly innocent, yet meticulously crafted questions that forced Douglas into a corner. His most famous example came from the Freeport debate. Can the people of a United States territory, in any lawful way, against the wish of any citizen of the United States, exclude slavery from its limits prior to the formation of a state constitution? This question, known as the Freeport Doctrine, forced Douglas to choose between popular sovereignty, his core belief, and the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision, which protected slavery in territories. Douglas's answer, while satisfying his Illinois audience, alienated him from the Southern Democrats, fracturing his own party. Lincoln's words, a carefully constructed question, became a political wedge. Lincoln also masterfully employed analogy and vivid imagery to make abstract concepts tangible. He didn't just talk about the principles of freedom, he made them resonate with everyday experience. In one debate, he famously described the nation as a house divided against itself cannot stand, echoing a biblical truth to convey the existential threat facing the Union due to slavery. This wasn't mere metaphor. It was a deeply ingrained understanding of how to connect with the shared moral and cultural consciousness of his audience. He understood that complex ideas, stripped of their academic pretense and cloaked in relatable imagery, possessed far greater persuasive power. Furthermore, Lincoln's rhetorical skill was rooted in his ability to maintain a moral high ground, while never appearing self-righteous. He combined unyielding logic with an undeniable humanity. He addressed Douglas not with vitriol, but with a respectful yet firm intellectual challenge. This allowed him to win over undecided voters who saw in him not just a skilled debater, but a man of profound conviction and integrity. He used his words to elevate the debate beyond mere political squabbling, transforming it into a profound discussion about the nation's future and its moral soul. His physical presence, too, added to his communication, his towering frame, his deliberate gestures, and the way he would often lean forward, drawing the audience into his quiet intensity. In the midst of these grueling debates, personal attacks from Douglas were not uncommon. Douglas often mocked Lincoln's appearance, his humble origins, and even his perceived awkwardness. Yet Lincoln rarely stooped to such tactics. He understood that engaging in personal mudslinging would detract from the weight of his arguments and lower the intellectual plane of the discussion. Instead, he would often disarm such attacks with a quiet wit or redirect the conversation back to the core issues. This discipline, this unwavering focus on the substance of the argument, rather than the superficiality of personal insult, was a testament to his profound understanding of effective communication. He taught that true victory in debate comes not from humiliating an opponent, but from illuminating the truth. The debates, though Lincoln lost the Senate seat to Douglas, were a pivotal moment. They catapulted him onto the national stage, showcasing his unique voice and intellectual power. Newspapers across the country reprinted their speeches, allowing Lincoln's arguments to reach far beyond the prairies of Illinois. He had used words, not just to win an election, but to articulate a compelling moral case against slavery that would resonate with millions. He had, with his deliberate, often understated, yet profoundly powerful rhetoric, forced the nation to confront the uncomfortable truths about its existence. He taught us that words, when wielded with purpose and conviction, can transcend personal ambition and become the very engine of historical change. He had shown the world how to lead with logic, to inspire with clarity, and to fight for an ideal, not with aggression, but with the quiet, undeniable force of truth. The presidency of Abraham Lincoln began not with a flourish of triumph, but with the terrifying echo of cannon fire. As he stepped onto the national stage, having honed his voice in frontier debates and courtroom battles, the Union was already fracturing. States were seceding, the specter of civil war loomed large, and the very existence of the United States hung by a thread. In this unprecedented crisis, Lincoln's words transformed from tools of persuasion into the anchors of a nation, the beacons of hope, and the instruments of a moral revolution. His first inaugural address, delivered on March 4, 1861, was a masterclass in diplomacy, firmness, and a desperate plea for unity. He faced an impossible task: to reassure the South while affirming the indestructibility of the Union, to appeal to reason while acknowledging deep-seated passions. He began with a conciliatory tone, assuring the Southern states that he had no intention of interfering with slavery where it already existed. This was strategic, a foundational attempt to de-escalate fear. But then, his language shifted, hardening with the unyielding logic forged in his legal career. He famously declared, "Physically speaking, we cannot separate. We cannot remove our respective sections from each other, nor build an impassable wall between them." Here, Lincoln used a simple, undeniable physical truth to illustrate a profound political reality. He appealed to common sense, to the very geography that bound them, stripping away the emotional rhetoric of secession to expose its impracticality. He then escalated his argument, moving from the physical to the philosophical, reminding them of the mystic cords of memory that bound them together. This was not a threat. It was a deeply emotional appeal to shared history, to a common heritage that transcended political differences. He aimed to evoke a sense of belonging, a poignant reminder of what they stood to lose. However, the address culminated in a firm yet sorrowful assertion of federal authority. He stated, "In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. This was a brilliant rhetorical move, placing the burden of initiation squarely on the seceding states. He offered peace but firmly delineated the line. His words in this moment were a tightly coiled spring, offering reconciliation while leaving no doubt about his resolve to preserve the Union. He spoke with the measured gravity of a man who understood the immense stakes, but also with the compassionate restraint that defined his character. As the war erupted and dragged on, Lincoln's communication became even more vital. He had to inspire a demoralized populace, stiffen the spines of faltering generals, and articulate the evolving purpose of a conflict that was costing untold lives. His weekly public letters, directives, and casual remarks were as important as his grand speeches. He often used relatable analogies and folksy wisdom to explain complex military strategies or political maneuvers to the common citizen. For example, he once explained the difficulty of replacing a general by saying, "It is a good deal like swapping horses when crossing a stream." This simple image, drawn from everyday frontier life, instantly conveyed the complexity and risk of such a decision, making it accessible to everyone. The most transformative use of his words during the war came with the Emancipation Proclamation, issued in two parts, a preliminary version in September 1862 and the final decree on January 1st, 1863. This document was not just a legal act, it was a profound moral declaration wrapped in military necessity. Critics often point to its somewhat dry, legalistic language, arguing it lacked the poetic flair of his later speeches. But this was precisely its power. Lincoln, the shrewd lawyer, knew that for the proclamation to have legal force and withstand challenges, it had to be framed within his constitutional authority as commander-in-chief during wartime. He didn't issue it as a moral sermon from a prophet, but as a military order from the president. He stated that slaves in rebellious states are and henceforward shall be free. The precision of "are" and "henceforward shall be" was critical, turning an author's aspiration into a legal fact, a declaration of intent into an immediate, irreversible status. It was a calculated use of formal language to achieve a revolutionary aim. Yet, even within its legal framework, the proclamation carried immense moral weight. It fundamentally changed the nature of the Civil War. It shifted the Union's cause, from merely preserving the Union to fighting for freedom and justice. Lincoln's words, in this single document, redefined the conflict, transformed the lives of millions, and irrevocably altered the course of American history. It was a strategic masterstroke disguised as a legal document, designed to both cripple the Confederacy and inspire moral fervor in the Union. The power here lay not just in what was said, but in the audacity of saying it within the bounds of law and military necessity. Beyond the grand declarations, Lincoln's capacity for empathy shone through his letters to grieving families. His letter to Lydia Bixby, a mother believed to have lost 5 sons in the war, is a poignant example. "I feel how weak and fruitless must be any word of mine which should attempt to beguile you from the grief of a loss so overwhelming." He didn't offer empty platitudes or try to diminish her pain. Instead, he acknowledged the immense suffering shared in it, and then elevated her sacrifice to a sacred national purpose. His words were a balm, recognizing shared humanity in the face of unbearable loss. This skill, to speak directly to the individual heart even while addressing the collective nation, was a rare gift, and it cemented his bond with the American people. The war years were a brutal test of his leadership, and every word he uttered or penned was scrutinized, analyzed, and often criticized. Yet, Lincoln persisted. He learned to manage the relentless noise of public opinion, to filter out the cynicism, and to focus his communication on the core principles that guided him, preserving the Union and eventually ending slavery. He understood that in a time of profound division, his words had to serve as a unifying force, not a divisive one. He rarely engaged in petty squabbles. Instead, he elevated the discourse, reminding everyone of the larger cause, the greater good. Lincoln's experience during the Civil War demonstrated that the power of words is not merely about eloquence, but about purpose, precision, and profound empathy. He used language to clarify the stakes, to inspire unwavering resolve, and to articulate a moral vision that would ultimately define a new America. In the face of unimaginable pressure and bloodshed, his voice remained steady, a guiding light through the storm, proving that even amidst chaos, the right words, spoken with conviction, can truly move mountains and mend a fractured nation. As the thunder of cannonades began to fade, and the long, brutal shadow of the Civil War slowly receded, Abraham Lincoln faced a challenge perhaps even more daunting than leading a nation through conflict: how to unite it in peace. The battlefields were turning to silence, but the echoes of hatred, bitterness, and profound division still reverberated across the land. In this fragile post-war landscape, Lincoln's words would be called upon to perform their most sacred duty: to heal, to reconcile, and to lay the groundwork for a future where a fractured nation could once again stand as one. His second inaugural address, delivered on March 4, 1865, just weeks before the war's end and his own assassination, stands as a monumental testament to his unique power over language. It is not merely a speech, it is a profound sermon, a poetic lament, and a timeless blueprint for reconciliation. Unlike many victory speeches, it offered no triumphalism, no gloating over the defeated South. Instead, it embraced a shared sense of national responsibility for the war's horrors. Lincoln famously stated, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves, and with all nations." These immortal lines are a masterclass in moral leadership expressed through language. The repetition of "with malice toward none, with charity for all" served as a powerful, almost liturgical refrain, urging a deeply wounded populace to transcend vengeance. He didn't just suggest forgiveness, he articulated a command for it, grounding it in a universal moral imperative. He shifted the focus from blame to collective healing, from retribution to reconstruction, both physical and spiritual. Notice the deliberate simplicity and profound depth of his vocabulary. There are no complex legal terms or convoluted arguments. Instead, he uses direct evocative language: malice, charity, to wounds, or care, or peace, words that resonate with every human heart. He acknowledged the immense suffering on both sides, subtly implying that the war was a divine judgment on both North and South for the sin of slavery, thereby diffusing blame and inviting shared penance. Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. This profound observation, delivered with solemnity, forced Americans to confront the terrible irony of their shared faith dividing them. This speech demonstrated Lincoln's unparalleled ability to distill profound theological and moral complexities into accessible, yet deeply moving prose. He was not just speaking to a political assembly, he was speaking to the conscience of a nation, urging a collective act of repentance and a shared commitment to a future built on compassion. He understood that true peace could not be coerced. It had to be cultivated through a change of heart, and his words were the seeds he planted. Beyond this iconic address, Lincoln's everyday communication also reflected his commitment to peace and unity. In his private conversations and directives, he emphasized rebuilding rather than punishing. For example, when asked how he would treat the defeated Confederates, he famously responded, "I shall treat them as if they had never been away." This simple, yet incredibly powerful sentence encapsulated his entire philosophy of reconciliation. It was a direct, clear statement of unconditional acceptance, designed to dismantle the very idea of punitive measures and foster an atmosphere of forgiveness. His words here were not just policy, they were an act of profound psychological healing. Consider his interactions with his generals and cabinet in the final days of the war. He was less concerned with chasing down fugitive Confederate leaders and more focused on ensuring a smooth transition to peace. His directives often carried a tone of urgency for ending the bloodshed and establishing a framework for states to rejoin the Union swiftly. He consistently spoke of binding up the nation's wounds, a phrase he returned to repeatedly, reinforcing the central mission of restoration. His language was always forward-looking, seeking to transcend the bitterness of the past for the promise of a future where all Americans, North and South, could coexist. Even in moments of personal triumph, Lincoln used his words to emphasize the collective good. After Richmond fell and he visited the Confederate capital, he walked through the devastated streets, speaking with awestruck citizens. He wasn't there to gloat, but to begin the arduous work of reunification. His informal remarks were simple, direct, and filled with a quiet determination to let 'em up easy. This phrase, again drawn from the common vernacular, conveyed his deep desire for a gentle and inclusive readmission of the Southern states into the Union. He understood that true victory was not merely conquest, but the restoration of brotherhood. Lincoln's vision for Reconstruction, articulated through his words, was revolutionary in its leniency for the time. He faced opposition from those in his own party who demanded harsh retribution for the South. Yet he held firm, knowing that vengeance would only perpetuate the cycle of hatred. His language consistently emphasized the necessity of forgiveness and the wisdom of mercy, arguing that a strong, united nation could only be built on a foundation of reconciliation, not resentment. He spoke of the common bond of sympathy, the shared American identity that needed to be rekindled. The power of Lincoln's words in this period stemmed from their profound moral authority. They were not mere political rhetoric. They were expressions of a deeply felt commitment to justice, compassion, and the enduring principles of American democracy. He understood that to heal a nation, he had to speak to its conscience, to remind it of its highest ideals, and to guide it away from the destructive impulses of anger and revenge. His words became a balm for a wounded soul, a compass for a lost ship, and a blueprint for a future that, tragically, he would not live to fully see. He taught us that true leadership in the aftermath of conflict requires not just strategic thinking, but a profound moral vocabulary, capable of articulating a path to enduring peace built on shared humanity. The last thunder of the Civil War had barely faded when a different kind of shockwave ripped through the nation: the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. His death, a cruel irony after his monumental efforts for peace, plunged a war-weary America into profound grief. The voice that had guided them through the darkest storm, the words that had unified and inspired, were silenced. Yet, in a twist of historical irony, it was in this very moment of silence that the true, immortal power of Lincoln's words began to echo across time, shaping not just his era, but every generation that followed. Lincoln understood, perhaps instinctively, that his legacy would be etched not only in his actions, but also in the very language he left behind. He crafted his public pronouncements with meticulous care, knowing they would be read, analyzed, and remembered. He built his arguments not just for immediate political effect, but for enduring moral resonance. This intentionality, combined with the inherent truth and humanity embedded in his style, is what grants his words their timeless power. Consider again the Gettysburg Address. In just 272 words, delivered in under 3 minutes, Lincoln did not recount military strategy or praise individual heroes. Instead, he redefined the purpose of the war. He anchored the conflict not just in preserving the Union, but in the founding principles of all men are created equal, and a government of the people, by the people, for the people. These phrases, simple yet profound, transformed a bloody battlefield into hallowed ground, and a brutal conflict into a fight for universal human dignity and democratic ideals. The power lay in its succinctness, its moral clarity, and its direct appeal to the highest aspirations of the American experiment: Decades later, these words would become a rallying cry for civil rights, democracy movements, and freedom fighters worldwide, proving that a powerful message, distilled to its essence, can transcend its original context and inspire new struggles for justice. His second inaugural address, dissected in our previous part, further solidified this immortal legacy. With malice toward none, with charity for all, was not merely a call for post-war reconciliation. It became a universal credo for overcoming division, a guiding principle for healing wounds, whether personal, communal, or national. This phrase, born from the anguish of civil war, speaks to the perennial human struggle to choose forgiveness over vengeance, empathy over hatred. It resonated in the aftermath of 2 world wars during the civil rights movement, and continues to be invoked in moments of national crisis and recovery today. Its power lies in its moral authority, its timeless appeal to the best angels of our nature. What made Lincoln's words so enduring? Firstly, their clarity and simplicity. He eschewed intellectual jargon and flowery rhetoric. His language was accessible, drawn from the common vernacular, making his profound ideas digestible to everyone from the frontier farmer to the urban intellectual. This simplicity was not a lack of sophistication. It was a deliberate choice to connect, to ensure his message permeated every corner of the nation. He understood that true persuasion comes not from complexity, but from crystalline clarity. Secondly, his words were imbued with moral authority and truth. Lincoln believed deeply in the principles he espoused, particularly the self-evident truth of human equality. His honesty, even when discussing uncomfortable truths like the nation's complicity in slavery, lent immense credibility to his arguments. When he spoke of freedom, it wasn't a political slogan. It was a deeply held conviction that resonated because it was true to his core being. This authenticity made his words resonate with a power that mere political expediency could never achieve. Thirdly, Lincoln was a master of narrative and analogy. From his earliest days on the frontier, he understood the power of a well-told story or a simple comparison to illuminate complex ideas. His house-divided speech, the swapping horses, in the middle of a stream analogy, or his numerous parables used to explain policy, all made his arguments memorable, relatable, and deeply human. He wasn't just presenting facts. He was telling a story, weaving a tapestry of shared understanding that transcended political divides. This approach made his arguments stick, embedding them in the collective consciousness. Finally, and perhaps most profoundly, Lincoln's words carried the weight of shared experience and empathy. He had lived through the very struggles he spoke about: poverty, loss, profound sadness, and the immense burden of leadership. When he spoke of suffering, it was with the authority of someone who had known it intimately. When he called for unity, it was from a place of deep compassion for all sides. This empathetic foundation transformed his words from mere policy statements into deeply human appeals that touched the hearts and minds of millions. He didn't just articulate the nation's pain, he embodied it, and then offered a path forward. The enduring echo of Lincoln's words is not confined to history books or presidential monuments. It resonates in every discussion about equality, every debate about democracy, every call for unity in times of division. His speeches are not just historical artifacts. They are living documents, continually reinterpreted and reapplied to new challenges. From Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech, drawing on Lincoln's vision of equality, to modern political discourse seeking to bridge divides, Lincoln's linguistic legacy continues to serve as a beacon. His mastery of communication provides invaluable life lessons for us today. It teaches us the profound impact of clarity in our own words, the importance of grounding our arguments in truth, the power of relatable storytelling, and the transformative force of empathy. It reminds us that our words, carefully chosen and authentically delivered, possess the power to shape not just our immediate interactions, but also the world around us, and potentially the generations that follow. Abraham Lincoln, the rail splitter turned president, may have been silenced by an assassin's bullet, but his voice, carried by the immortal power of his words, continues to speak. It whispers lessons of resilience, shouts calls for justice, and sings songs of unity across the vast expanse of American history. His legacy is not just what he did, but what he said. Words that continue to inspire, to challenge, and to illuminate the path forward for anyone who seeks to lead, to understand, or simply to connect with the profound human experience.